When we talk about ecology, we're usually talking about relationships. Ecology, at its core, is the study of how living things interact with each other and the environment around them. It's about systems, how humans, animals, plants, and landscapes are all connected in ways that are constantly shaping one another. For a long time, though, those relationships were imagined in a specific way. Nature was often framed as something separate from humans, something out there that we could observe, study, or even control. But that idea is becoming harder and harder to maintain, because now we're living in what many scholars call the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene describes a moment where human activity becomes one of the dominant forces shaping the Earth itself. Climate change, industrialization, pollution, mass extraction, these are no longer just social or economic processes, they're geological ones. Human history and Earth's history are now deeply entangled. This is something we see in Planet Under Pressure's Welcome to the Anthropocene video, which visualizes just how quickly human activity has advanced within the last century alone. The video compresses that time to show how industrialization, population growth, and environmental transformations all have spiked in a very short period of time. It makes it clear that the scale of human impact is not gradual, it's explosive. At this point, it becomes almost impossible to separate what is nature from what is human-made. But once we even start thinking in terms of the Anthropocene, a new problem emerges. Because if humans are shaping the planet on a massive scale, then that means that we're also shaping how that transformation is represented, expressed, and interpreted. In other words, we're not just changing the Earth, we're also controlling the narrative about how those changes are understood. So this raises a question that I want this video to explore. What happens when humans try to frame the Anthropocene in their own image? More specifically, what happens when art that is meant to critique environmental destruction is created by the same systems of capitalism, visibility, and profit that drove that environmental destruction in the first place? Can art fully escape those systems, or is it at risk of reproducing them even as it critiques them? I am Tristan Jackson, and here at Critique Lens Studios, that's the exact tension that I want to explore in today's video through manufactured landscapes. When I first watched Manufactured Landscapes, I had the reaction that I think the film wants you to have, which is awe, like AWE, awe, not AWWR anyways. One of the film's opening sequences involves a long tracking shot inside of a massive Chinese factory. The camera moves slowly across rows and rows of these factory workers assembling products. The line stretches for so long that it becomes impossible to even see where it ends. At first, it's overwhelming. The repetition of bodies and movements feels so mechanical. The scale is hard to process. And yet, the image is incredibly controlled, smooth, steady, visually precise even. Even in this moment of intense industrial labor, with workers likely being somewhat exploited, working long hours just to provide for their families, the film makes this somewhat mesmerizing. There is something to be said about whether or not most of this is Backwell's interpretation of Edward Brzezinski's photography style and kind of the way that he chooses to frame some of these images, but regardless of whether it's a metacritique or not, both of their film styles, whether photography or Backwell's film Manufactured Landscapes that she's directing, they kind of both serve the same purpose, so I can't really separate them as of now. I will say, a lot of the scenes throughout serve to show one of Manufactured Landscapes' greatest strengths, and that's the ability to show scale. We see this again in the quarry scenes, where entire landscapes have been carved into these crazy geological forms. The Earth itself looks reshaped, cut, flattened, and reorganized into something that's somewhat unrecognizable from what it once was. Later, in the oil field sequences, the land seems quite saturated with industry. Machinery, pipelines, and residue dominate the frame, turning what once might have been a landscape into an industrial platform. These scenes make something very clear. Environmental destruction is not isolated. It's not contained. It's something that is repeated, something that is systematic, and it's something that's global. The film is incredibly effective at showing that what we're looking at is not just damage, but infrastructure, human infrastructure. It gives us what we might call planetary perspective, helping us see the interconnected systems that link labor, production, consumption, and environmental transformation all across the globe. Unfortunately, however, depending on how you look at it, many of these scenes are composed in ways that are visually striking. Take the factory shot again. The repetition of workers creates a pattern. The camera movement is smooth, the composition precise. Or the recycling scenes, where piles and piles of electronic waste stretch across the screen. The textures, colors, and intentional propositions create a scene that feels almost painter-esque, even though it is quite literally toxic waste. This creates tension at the center of the film, because while these images are showing the destruction, they invite us as the viewer to appreciate them visually. And that creates this kind of distance. Instead of reacting with discomfort and then towards urgency, we remain in this position of observation. We look, we take in the scale, we notice the composition, but we aren't necessarily forced into a position of confrontation. The destruction becomes something we can sit with, rather than something that disrupts us. This becomes even clearer when we think about extraction. In the aforementioned quarry scenes, the transformed Earth resembles this sort of geometric art. At that massive scale, it becomes difficult to relate to that land as something to be lived in or inhabited in, which unfortunately takes away our ability to sympathize with it, since we humans can't see ourselves in that nature necessarily. Instead, in those scenes, that land just becomes surface, material, resources. And that's exactly what extraction does for us. It turns these environments into usable, contributing parts of a larger system. What's also interesting is that the film's visual style sometimes mirrors that transformation. By organizing these tattered landscapes into clean, striking compositions, the film makes extraction almost legible, kind of aesthetically pleasing even. So even as the work of Apakwa or Bertinsky and others serves to critique these systems, it risks reproducing the same logic of control and organization that defines them in the first place. That tension becomes even more visible when we look at labor. Going back to that opening factory scene, workers are lined up in rows, repeating the same actions over and over and over again. Their individual identity becomes completely absorbed into this larger system that we're seeing. Later, in the recycling scenes, workers sort through electronic waste by hand. So shuffling through this toxic waste, as we talked about before, is a part of their everyday routine. These are powerful images, but they also beg a deeper question. What do we actually know about these workers? We see them, but we don't hear them. We observe their labor, but we don't have any access to their experiences. This is where author Anna Singh's idea of precarity becomes pretty useful. Singh describes precarity as life without stability, conditions that are shaped by uncertainty, exploitation, and uneven systems. And that framework can help us understand how environmental damage and labor exploitation are deeply connected. The same systems, human systems, that exhaust landscapes also exhaust people. And while manufactured landscapes visually show us these concepts, they don't challenge us to interact with it on a level any deeper than that. Workers remain part of the image, but not quite fully centered, not fully part of the narrative necessarily. I think that scene matters a lot, because the way that we see environmental destruction really does judge how we respond to it. In those scenes near the end of the film, massive ships are dismantled piece by piece. The scale is incredible. The visuals are striking. But once again, the viewer is positioned at a distance, watching the process unfold, rather than being drawn to its human or its ecological consequences. And that distance can be dangerous, because the Anthropocene is not just about what's happening to the planet. It's about whether or not we can view those changes in ways that lead to meaningful response. If environmental harm becomes something that we can simply admire visually, then that risks it becoming normalized, even if it's being put in our faces. And if anything, the more it's being put in our faces at that point, the more that it risks normalization. That's where I see my own intervention in relation to the film. What I want to do with this video is not to reject manufactured landscapes, but to pressure it and works like it. I want to stay with its images and the popularity of them, while also questioning the comfortable viewing position that they can create. Because I think the danger of aestheticized destruction is that it allows us to believe that we've confronted the ecological harm. Me at home watching a film or going to a gallery walk and looking at photographs of it, when in reality we've only consumed a visually pleasing version of it. And in our daily lives, we continue to consume products that hold up that same environmental destruction that we find so disturbing when looking at it from afar. So my hope is for that distance to become visible, not just to see the damage within a landscape, but also the gap between that damage and how we, the viewer, are taught to see it. In the end, manufactured landscapes reveal something important about the Anthropocene, that the world has been reshaped on a massive scale by systems of extraction, labor, and industry. But it also reveals a deeper problem, that even when we try to critique environmental destruction, we may be adding to it, upholding it even. And that even when we try to see environmental destruction, we may just be doing so through frameworks that distance us from it. So the question isn't just what we're seeing, but more how we're seeing it. Because if destruction manages to look beautiful, clean, and organized, then we're still not seeing it clearly enough. From Tristan Jackson, head writer here at Critical Lens Studio, thank you for watching the video. I hope you have a great rest of your day.